All right. Um, let's get started. We're going to talk tonight about the emergent war, which is upon us in that area of the world called the Middle East. As most people know, this has been a cockpit of war for almost its entire existence. And I'm going to look at this from a completely different perspective than most people are actually used to. People who follow the area know that there have been a series of attempts at peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis over a long period of time, all of which has failed. And in the breakout of this most recent horrendous killing, which started with the terrorist massacre of Israeli civilians and has resulted now in a burgeoning threat of an expanded war in the area. One of the things which has been a kind of a sideshow, or would appear to be such to people, is that President Trump came out at the very beginning of this and attacked Benjamin Netenyahu of Israel and basically blamed him in many respects for what's going on. What people don't realize is that's a widespread sentiment. You wouldn't realize it from the news which has come out attacking Trump in the United States, but that is a widespread sentiment in Israel itself. And there are reasons for that, which I will get into tonight. Now, the way Trump's basic attack on Netanyahu has been portrayed is, once again, Trump is putting his own ego before the security interests of the United States. Once again, Trump is making himself the center of a worldwide conflict, which he really has nothing to do that with. Once again, it's Trump's ego, which is fully on display here. And I will tell you right now, all of that is the most incredible bunch of BS you're ever going to encounter in a strategic situation, but is really quite par for the course in terms of the history of this thing. Now, I'm going to focus on two people who essentially shifted for the better for the first time since 1948, really. This entire British-controlled cockpit of hybrid warfare. Those two people are Lyndon LaRouches and Donald Trump. And there's a linkage between the two of them. In 2002, after a long history in this area, which actually began in 1974-75, LaRouches was invited to the Middle East by the then segments of the Israeli government and segments of what was then the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. And he was asked to formulate or come up with some idea of how a peace might be forged in the area. And that particular 1975 excursion, in which he met with all important figures in the area, resulted in an overall development plan for the Middle East, which was then called the Oasis Plan for Middle East Development. Now, what happened to LaRouches in the aftermath of that is that he came back to the United States, and we immediately became the target of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, which went on the attack and started characterizing LaRouches as the worst kind of anti-Semite in history, when in fact what he had done was to attempt to talk about a development proposal which would actually work for the area. I'm going to leave the ADL at that. People can see what they're doing and have done within the framework of the current drive against Trump and the current drive against the MAGA movement, and come to your own conclusions as to what that thing was really all about. What it was about was Lyndon LaRouche stuck his nose in something which was a very fixed geometry, which was actually designed to keep this entire area of the world in permanent warfare. Now, when he went to, there was a second time that LaRouche actually went to the area, and that was in 2002, at the invitation of the Zayed Center in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And he gave a speech there, again, talking about the potentials for a Middle East peace. And in that speech, what he talked about was the way people normally think about the Middle East on a kind of a profile is, well, really, all of this warfare is about oil. Okay, that's what it's about. It's about oil. And he said, well, that's true but to a very, very limited extent. He said, if you look at the actual history of the area, you'll see that this is the crossroads of human history. This is the crossroads between Eurasia and Africa. Eurasia being Europe and Asia, and Africa, perhaps the most important trade corridor, potentially, for all of the world in human history. And he said, in essence, that control of this crossroads is far more important to the players in the world than even oil as the riches to be tapped in the area. That, in other words, the geopolitical control of the potentials of this region as a major development arena for the entire world was at the center of why this has been made a cockpit of war by the British throughout all of history. And he said, the way you want to look at this is put yourself in a space capsule and go back in all of human history and watch, 11,000, 15,000 years ago, the glacier, which started to melt in Eurasia. And that glacier produced huge deserts, which are the most fundamental problem in this entire arena of the world. Desertification, the lack of water. How do we solve that? How do we make the deserts bloom? That's a man-made vision, which is really, really important for all development. Look at the transportation in this area. It doesn't exist. How can you create transportation corridors and development corridors for the entire area, which will actually bring peace? And then finally, he said, and he's talking about the greater Middle East. He's not talking about Israel, qua Israel, and Palestine, qua Palestine. He's saying, look at the entire area of, the Gulf, peninsula, the crossroads into Africa, the Holy Land within that, and think about how you can make the entire area prosper. He said the other key to this is obviously power. You need advanced sources of power. It doesn't mean that oil is going to disappear as a resource, but as we advance to nuclear power and other things, what will happen is that oil will take its appropriate place as a feedstock for petrochemicals as we power the area through nuclear power. Quite a vision he laid out. And subsequently, when he spoke about this in 2009 in a post which I've put up on the website, he had another occasion to address this. And he said, don't look at this from the standpoint of Israel and Palestine. That obviously has been a situation which various people have tried to approach over many, many years and tried various efforts to solve. It can't be solved that way. The title of his talk at that point was, in order to change the Middle East, change the world in which the Middle East and Israel and Palestine actually exist. A completely different approach, because he says you've got to have thunderous development You've got to have an understanding of culture. And most of all, you need to have a secure foundation to it. Now, in his speech in Abu Dhabi, he cited the four rim states around the Gulf itself as being the places that he would look for stability. A lot happened in that area, obviously, between 2002 and 2009, and has happened since, particularly with Barack Obama's obscene approach to the thing in the form of the Arab Spring, and the Bush administration's effort to entirely remake the area in the image of Bush's vision of a democracy. Both approaches were catastrophic in terms of anything happening in the region, and set into motion the dynamics which are going on today. Now, getting back to Donald Trump, I'm going to tell you a story which will probably amaze many of you and will put his remarks about Bibi Netanyahu into a context for you. Much of what I'm about to say is drawn from interviews both with Trump and with his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who he made the primary architect of a series of understandings called the Abraham Accords. Abraham standing for the three great Abrahamic religions, to which Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I remark sideways that the first thing Biden did was to say, we're not going to call these things the Abraham Accords through the State Department. We're going to call them the Middle East Reconciliation. In terms of thinking about what must be done in the area, just think about that. You got State Department ease versus a grand cultural idea of uniting the three world's great religions on the highest possible level of potential development. Now, the way Jared Kushner tells it is that early on in 2016, the Trump campaign, while it still was in its nascent transition phases and earlier phases, was approached by the Saudis. Jared Kushner in particular. You got to think about that. Here's this Orthodox Jew being approached by the Saudis to talk about development and peace in the area. And, basically what they had to say was, we want to work with you and we want to help bring about a peace in the area. And, what then happened, as Kushner tells it, is he said, I don't know what to say or do in that regard. And I said, well, you have to make, peace with the Israelis. You have to recognize Israel and you have to cut out funding terrorism and you have to do other things. And the Saudis didn't blanch at that. And they said, we're ready to actually talk about doing that. Now, move ahead a little bit and you'll see that the very first trip that Trump took as president was to Saudi Arabia. And what did he do there? He gathered, basically all of the Arab states that he could gather in one room, and he spoke to them straightforwardly. And he says, listen, here's the deal, guys. We can make a deal. You can actually work with the United States, but there's a couple of preconditions. You guys have to stop funding terrorism. You guys have to stop funding these jihadis. You guys have to stop hybrid warfare in this area of the world, and then we can come to some sort of understanding. Simultaneously, as Kushner tells the story, there were entrees from the UAE, which is very close to the Saudis, but very different than the Saudis, had a different perspective on many things going on then in the Middle East, particularly the war in Yemen, which is gradually over the years finally coming to an end. But the UAE, remember, is where LaRouche gave his talk. And the key driver towards what then became the Abraham Accords happened to be the UAE. And I think about this from the standpoint that LaRouche's ideas really did have a resonance, which actually threw an even different kind of insurgent and upsetter of the extant sort of game board for the area, created the possibility of a real peace. And that was Donald Trump. Now, the way Trump looked at this, and Jared makes it very clear that my father-in-law is in no way an ideologue. He's a pragmatist in the sense that he wants to get things done. He has a vision of the future, and most fundamentally, he wants to make a deal. Those of you who've been around the LaRouche movement for some time recognize how much Lyndon LaRouche put stock in all of his various proposals for peace, the idea of the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the horrendous 30 Years War and Dark Age in Europe, a religious war, just like the religious war we seem to be setting ourselves upon now, yet once again. And the idea of the Peace of Westphalia is to always negotiate for the good of the other, to figure out what people actually want and is to their advantage in a negotiation, and to figure out how to come closest to that for both sides. Trump, in his art of the deal and in his approach to these things, thinks in exactly that way, although I'm sure that the various scholars and other people who look at these things would characterize that as a crude vision of the Peace of Westphalia, the way he expresses it. But nonetheless, it is an efficient way of saying exactly the same thing. So what happened was that over the course of time, he sent Jared Kushner to the Middle East. He met with all of the key parties over a very long period of time, worked and worked and worked on what would become, in its initial phase, the Trump administration strategic vision for Middle East peace. And, essentially before that was announced, for the first time, various Arab states actually recognized, other than Jordan and Egypt, actually recognized the existence of Israel. The first time that had occurred in decades, ever since the Oslo Accords. There had been no progress at all. And in fact, what Obama did and all of the key Middle East State Department did was essentially reverse any kind of progress which had been made way back in the Clinton administration through the Oslo Accords. So they lined up the fundamentals for a fundamental breakthrough. And the first announcement of this scope of plan, so to speak, occurred at the White House in January of 2020. And essentially what happened was that Israel and the United States there announced, or was set up to announce, the vision for a deal which encompassed several of the Gulf states recognizing Israel, again led by the UAE. And at that point, when all of these negotiations had been done and they were making great progress, and the idea was to have 3 or 4 of the Gulf nations actually work towards a perspective on this throughout 2020, and that, of course, was a very difficult year for all of us and the Trump administration itself, but to work through in all of 2020 towards a formal accord in this regard. So at this ceremony, what was outlined was the concessions which the Trump administration had made to Israel. And essentially those concessions included the fact that the U.S. embassy would be moved to Jerusalem, and the United States would recognize for the first time Israeli control of the Golan Heights. There is a whole separate part of the Abraham agreements, which were then being negotiated with the Arab participants and the Palestinians in that. And, Trump was told, as Jared says, by all of the experts, and the British were all over this, believe me, the current head of MI6 was in direct contact with Jared and providing the British view throughout this. But essentially, the idea was, as Trump's art of the deal says, you give the Israelis the best you can give them, which is what Trump was prepared to give at that point, and you stop there and you turn to the other side and you say, here's what we're going to give you. And here's where the rub comes between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu big time. Because at this ceremony, which was the outline of the agreement, Netanyahu got up and gave a speech in which he completely mischaracterized what was being agreed to. And he said that the United States was going to back further annexation by Israel immediately in the West Bank, which had nothing to do with anything Trump had agreed to. Trump, needless to say, was furious. It almost blew up everything that was happening and had occurred through this entire 3.5 long, traumatic negotiation for the framework. And, basically there ensued a dramatic behind the scenes battle in which Netanyahu was backed down, embarrassed, told to go fly a kite, and essentially put in a position where it became possible and the Arabs could see that Trump was serious and these agreements were back on. So essentially then what happened was, let's have the development part of this sketched out. And what was, again, begun to be sketched through in a conference in Bahrain and Oman and other places is a $15 billion development plan for Palestine, for essentially the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, involving all of these Arab countries in the development project, and also involving ancillary development projects through those countries. The fundamental ideas central to that development project, although not anywhere near the scale of what Lyndon LaRouche envisioned, nonetheless, it went along the same lines. Desalinization, water, power, major infrastructure projects to actually bring this about, transportation corridors. Again, not the grand plan of Lyndon LaRouche, but exactly along the right lines nonetheless. $15 billion initially, to be brought to bear on infrastructure projects to make this idea of an integrated Middle East, of which, it's called the outside-in plan, all right? The outside-in plan. Now think about that from the standpoint of the same concept by LaRouche. Outside-in, rather than these two historical foes where the hatreds are baked in, essentially confronting each other over and over and over again within the same territory. The funny thing that Jared Kushner says about this is that it probably all worked out because I was naive. I didn't know what I was doing. I was asking a lot of questions, which all of the people who've been doing this for years hadn't thought about. I stumbled through it, and I had the backing of an actual leader, Donald Trump, who was prepared to upset the actual apple cart on the way to peace. So, in defense of Donald Trump, he hit the right target when he actually went after Bibi for this particular new fiasco. It is true, all of the things which you read on the Israeli side of this, or on the Palestinian side of this, as to the horrendousness of the situation, the occupation, the horror of the entire thing. I can provide very good accounts from each side, written about what the present settlers movement led kind of government in Israel has done. I can also point out to you that Israel is right now completely split. That's the on-the-ground situation. Netanyahu, in pursuit of again and again and again this whole idea of seizing Arab lands over and over and over again, sought to actually change on behalf of his current political backers, the Israeli Supreme Court, who had stood in the way of many of these seizures and many of the worst, types of atrocities which occurred on the Arab side of things. And the Israeli society was in a complete uproar against that. He had also been playing the British divide and conquer game between the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank being controlled by the PLO, and Gaza being controlled by Hamas. He had managed to actually have Qatar deliver large sums of money into Hamas, and actually play a game of, thinking that he was controlling Hamas, when in reality, that's really not true at all. And most of the Israeli public recognizes that the security lapse which occurred here is exactly as Donald Trump defined it. This is Bibi. Bibi, after the shooting is over, if we don't end up in a conflagration involving the entire world, will no longer be a leader of Israel, period, end of story, because Jewish people actually realize what has happened here. The Israelis actually realize what has happened here, and the game that's being played or has been played over a very long period of time for this entire area. So I wanted to tell you this story because now the Abraham Accords, the outside-in theory, the brand new theory, which Donald Trump had, is universally hailed, despite the fact that it was condemned by all sides at the time that it occurred as ridiculous, stupid, naive, impossible, and largely blacked out from the entire population as to what the heck it was. It can be expanded upon. The theory is correct, but the point is that only by upsetting the apple cart, as Trump has done on so many occasions through his leadership, is it possible to even to begin to divine a solution to this age-old cockpit of war, in which sects of religious fanatics on both sides of the equation compete for power, all under the thumb of the globalist British financial empire, which is really the dynamic which controlled the area in its total prior to Trump actually, again, changing the strategic chessboard. So his attack on Netanyahu, while perhaps not exactly what various people wanted to hear, is not some grievance. It's a very pinpointed, if you actually understand the history, a very pinpointed attack as to who was at fault in terms of the security of Israel in this process. Now, we're having coming out of it a whole side of the Republican Party, the neoconservative side, the side of the party which is tied to Christian Zionism in particular, on as part of the religious side of this, other aspects of this which are jockeying up at this point for a war with Iran. And you'll recall that Trump explicitly rejected that also. The point of the Abraham Accords was to, in essence, surround the radicals in Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood with a different type of Sunni Muslim alliance, something very different, which hadn't really occurred before. But people learn, human beings learn from their mistakes. And again, I cite to you the fact that I think that Lyndon LaRouche's vision on both sides of the equation, the outside-in approach, changing the dynamic, was about to bear fruit. That's my view of why we're in the present conflict we're in. It was about to bear fruit. As Trump likes to say, were it not for 2020 and the election, I would have had a deal with Iran, and it would have been part of this entire Abraham Accord process. So I wanted to give people that overview, and I want Bruce to chime in at this point a little bit in terms of things that I haven't covered. But I think it's an essential idea here. And it's exactly this type of, no, we're not going to have a war here now, where you see those sides coming together that Biden is trying to package, Ukraine aid with new aid for Israel. And that's how we're going to continue the Ukraine war, according to the likes of these people, while we also, have a potential real conflagration in the Middle East. So I will leave it at that and ask Bruce to actually chime in, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Let me just make 2 points, which I think will elaborate 2 principles that you can glean from what Barbara just reported to us. The first is the importance of the United States in solving these problems in the world. That you just look at the account of the various countries, and I'm not, the Saudis are one, but we also have the incidents with North Korea, also with Russia, and even with China. And all these countries and the leaders of those countries, as soon as Trump got in and upset the apple cart, they all wanted to come and work with the United States. They realized that Trump had overthrown the decades of failure that had been governing the United States for the last 40 years. And you can go all the way back to the failures of the Nixon administration under Kissinger, the failures of the Carter administration, even Reagan's foreign policy, which had the Iran-Contra scandal in it, being run by people like George Shultz and so forth, and George H.W. Bush, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration. This was all governed by experts who work on a problem for their entire career, fail every step of the way, and are called experts. And if you remember, when Trump got in there, everybody said, Trump's not listening to his own experts. Well, who were these own experts? These were failed people. Kushner tells a story, continuing the story about the discussions with Saudi Arabia. And he said that before there was a scheduled telephone conference between President Trump and King Mohammed bin Salman. And before the meeting, they met in the Oval Office, and Rex Tillerson, who was an expert, former head of Exxon, who had many relations with the Saudis, and Mattis, who big expert, military expert. And they said, Kushner laid out his discussions and what the potential was. And they all said, oh, it'll never work. The Saudis never keep their word. You're getting the wool pulled over your eyes. And Kushner said, well, we ought to give it a try. But the expert says, no, it's never going to happen. And then Trump gets on the phone with the king, and he lays out these proposals. And the king says, yeah, we'll go along with it. And Trump said, well, who should we work with? And he says, work with my son, the deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And he says, okay, I'll have him tell him to work directly with Jared, bypassing Tillerson and Mattis and all the experts. So the willingness to go around the experts that the media and everybody else tries to tell you that Trump needs to pay attention to the experts was precisely what led to whatever success he was able to accomplish. And but that underscores the importance of winning this campaign in 2024 and actually shifting the politics of the United States away from the failures who have been running it and towards something which now is not just new, but new and proven to work, as we have from the experience of the first 4 years of the Trump administration, despite all the difficulties it encountered as a result of all the operations. There's a lot of people out there who like to say, well, there's a new multipolar world out there, and the United States is an imperial power, and it's gonna screw everything up, and we've got to come up with a way to solve these problems without the United States. And that is precisely the wrong way to think. The right way to think is fix the United States. We have a simple problem with the United States. And we all know why. So the second thing, the second principle here is one that LaRouche talked about explicitly, and you can get a sense from Trump that he addresses it also in a different way. But that is the ability to actually change the principles, the axiomatic principles that everyone is operating on. After the Oslo Accord, Prime Minister Rabin, who was assassinated right after this process, and remember that Rabin was a Israeli hardliner. He brutally suppressed the first Intifada. He was a military man. He was not a softie, but he and Shimon Peres organized and agreed to the Oslo Accords. And he said, change will come based on people who are willing to change their axioms, to add something new to the equation that changes the axioms on which everybody is based. And as Barbara indicated, in this case, everybody has said, and this has been the construct on both sides, that you cannot get peace in the Middle East until you solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Otherwise, you'll never get any peace. And everybody believed that, and everybody acted from that. And as LaRouche pointed out, take a different approach. Take this to a higher level. And between, based on what LaRouche said and also what Trump did and has since said, which he's been attacked for, that's what has to be done now. Now you look at this current situation, and it's quite dangerous, and it's very easy for people to begin to draw scenarios and conclusions as to what will follow, some of which are quite awful and follow logically and linearly from the events which have occurred. There's absolutely correct that the Israelis will respond very forcefully to the horrific killings by Hamas, as every sovereign country did. Look at the way Putin responded to the horrific attacks in the 1990s, and I mean in the early 2000s around Chechnya, or the way any sovereign nation would have to put down something as brutal and ugly as the Muslim Brotherhood. And remember that it was going all the way back to Brzezinski that the policy, and George H.W. Bush in the fight with the financing the Mujahideen, or the support that Obama gave to the Muslim brother, to the Al-Qaeda to create ISIS, as General Flynn said. The US and the British have had a long-standing policy of working with and supporting the very fundamentalists which they right now claim to oppose. Trump took that on. So you have to be willing to overthrow the experts and overthrow the traditions in order to get a peace. So this situation is very dangerous, and those people in the United States who are attacking Trump, who are going off on this, like Nikki Haley or Lindsey Graham or many Democrats going off on we're going to bomb Iran and we're going to bomb Lebanon, and we're going to bomb Syria, and we're going to bomb Russia, and we're going to bomb China, and we're going to bomb everybody in the world. First of all, it's all a bunch of bluff and bluster, because the U.S., as everybody knows, its military is so depleted right now that we can't even supply artillery shells to Ukraine. And so the idea the U.S. is going to go on to another war is absolutely insane. So people who are bluffing and blustering about that only create a real contrast with the approach that Trump is taking. And so if you want to shift the situation in the Middle East and defuse this very dangerous situation as it's developing, change the situation in the United States. Show the world that there is hope, that this administration that's currently put the U.S. on a war course and put the world on a war course is going out the door. And the American people are going to reassert themselves and bring back a government which will actually, as Trump says, get along with all these people. So I think that's what I would add to this thing. And maybe there's a lot of other things we can say, but let's get some questions and we can bring it out in the context of the Q&A.